Has Ireland given illegal tax incentives to Apple? The European Commission orders the US tech giant to repay billions of dollars in tax. What does the demand mean for doing business in the European Union? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. It is the biggest tax demand ever imposed by the European Union. The Irish government's been ordered to recover almost $15 billion of unpaid taxes from Apple. The world's richest technology company has its headquarters in California, but its European base is in Ireland. The European Commission says the Irish government granted illegal state aid by helping Apple to artificially lower its tax bill for more than 20 years. Both parties deny tax evasion and are planning appeal. So what makes Ireland so attractive to foreign firms? We'll discuss this issue with our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Lawrence Lee.
If someone told you you had a spare $14 billion at your disposal, then here are some people you might easily help. They try to make the very best of their trailer park, but the landlord has, with regret, told everyone here he's shutting down. Such is the lack of affordable housing that Conor, Paulina and their 3-year-old face homelessness.
You know, we literally are left with no choice, and you know, we don't even have the choice of going back to, say, our mother's house or something, because my mother's is already full, so it would mean Paulina going back to her mother's and then me going back to mine and sleeping on the couch. So
with a 3-year-old?
Oh well, she'd be going back with Paulina, so we'd be breaking our family up.
The fact that the European Commission has put a number to the amount of tax from Apple that Ireland has foregone and now says it doesn't want has raised difficult questions about priorities.
Successive Irish governments never actually put a figure on how much tax they'd let Apple get away with not paying, but nobody here expected the European Commission to place the figure as high as $14.5 billion. But for context, that figure is actually more than 4 years' worth of annual austerity cuts that the previous Irish government imposed on its people during the financial crisis.
With reported splits emerging inside the coalition government, opposition MPs are demanding that the tax is collected and spent on the people.
We have the most expensive childcare in Europe, and we have a homelessness crisis that we have been really struggling to deal with, and that requires investment.
Yet so important is Ireland's financial centre and low tax reputation that officials took themselves to the City of London on Wednesday morning to assure investors that Ireland would not bow to the demands for a fairer tax system.
And that would be, what a lot of people would think, and that's what the Commission is prompting them to think. But the point about this, that would be short-term gain for long-term pain, because the people employed in the foreign direct investment companies in Ireland, they pay an enormous amount of personal tax in USC and in income tax. And if they lose their jobs, they won't pay the tax.
In the end, it feels unarguable that Ireland needs Apple far more than Apple needs Ireland. Having gone this far to attract the richest global brands, this country seems now at their mercy. Lawrence Lee, Al Jazeera, Dublin.
Let us now bring in our guests for this discussion. In London, Conor McCabe, lecturer in global finance at the University College, Dublin School of Social Work, Social Policy and Social Justice. In Brussels, Tove Maria Ryding, Policy and Advocacy Manager at the European Network on Debt and Development. In London, Liza Lovdahl-Gormsen, Director of the Competition Law Forum at the British Institute of International and Comparative Law. Very pleased to have all three of you on the show. Conor McCabe, Apple and Ireland in the EU's crosshairs. How do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, this is part of a wider problem in Ireland at this moment. I mean, last year there were 92,000 companies who paid zero corporation tax in Ireland, and that was a rate of nearly 68% of all companies that were liable for tax in that year paid zero corporation tax. So what we see in Ireland since 2003 is a shift in policy away from direct investment and towards foreign direct tax avoidance. And this has structural problems for the state itself, because as more and more companies pay kind of less tax, then there are problems in trying to combat the very serious structural problems that are building up in the state in terms of roads, housing, transport, and income education itself. So in terms of Ireland, part of the discussion that is going on is where does this fit in terms of the wider kind of social contract? Should we have Ireland as a tax haven and have all of the structural problems that come with that, or do we try and actually have a state that balances these kind of tensions among kind of business, state and its citizens?
Tove, Maria, Ryding, important, pressing problems raised there by Conor McCabe. But what is your response to this? And what do you make of the timing? Why now?
Well, I think one important point is that the negative consequences of this don't just occur in Ireland. What we saw was that Apple has actually moved profits that they've made in Africa, in the Middle East, in India, and in all of Europe. And they moved these profits to Ireland, obviously because they have a very sweet tax deal with the Irish government. That means that they have to pay very, very low taxes. But in terms of the question, why now? Well, one of these deals that were exposed yesterday, it's actually more than 25 years old. So I would rather say, why not sooner? Why did it take so long before the EU started questioning this deal?
Liza, Lovdahl-Gormsen, as it's been raised there, it's been known for some time now, but why do you think this is playing out now? What's behind it?
Well, I think we need to make absolutely clear that both personal tax as well as corporation tax is a national issue, and the EU cannot do anything about these things because tax is on a national level. So this is a matter of sovereignty. There is no harmonized rules on the EU level that harmonizes corporation tax. So that's a reason why they can't just interfere.
So many issues raised there, companies getting away with murder, how widespread it is, and sovereignty. But let me ask you again, Liza, I mean, could there be a bit of jealousy in Europe? I mean, could that be behind this decision? Many of the European states looking at Ireland and saying, well, how come Ireland can get away with this? Why don't we do the same?
Exactly, because there is no harmonized rules. There is not a directive or a regulation on corporation tax or personal tax on the European level. That means there is tax competition between the various member states in Europe. And when you have smaller economies like Ireland, you can imagine the attraction of getting big corporations to come to Ireland. So there is definitely a competition between the member states. And of course, Ireland is not the only country involved. You also have the Netherlands and you have Luxembourg.
Tove, is that one of the factors behind this decision? And it possibly just shows how tax policy cuts really go to the core of economic competitiveness for many of these countries.
Well, it's not really economic competitiveness, because if we look at what actually creates jobs in Europe, it's small and medium enterprises that actually creating the jobs for us and the large incomes. And it's not just Apple that has one of these special deals. It's also, for example, McDonald's, it's Starbucks. There are many other companies that have these deals. And if you imagine a small shop trying to sell coffee, that has to compete with Starbucks that has one of these deals so it doesn't have to pay taxes. That makes it impossible for small companies to compete. So it's not logic in an economic sense, but it is very true that our governments are locked in this absurd race to the bottom, and more countries are introducing these loopholes that are only for multinational corporations, and of course they're being abused. So our governments are failing to cooperate on this issue.
Conor, is that what's going on, that multinationals and their behavior is bad? They behave as they want, they pay very little in return for the benefits that they get?
Yes, I mean, like part of what is going on is that since 2003, well, like prior to that, Ireland did have special kind of tax zones for kind of multinationals, but these were kind of phased out from 2003 onwards. Now, since then, all of Ireland has, in effect, has become a special kind of tax zone. So, if the Irish state wants to bring in special deals for multinationals, there's nothing really to stop kind of local businesses from availing of them as well. This is where a race to the bottom that can be seen as like chasing kind of multinationals turns into something that's a lot more structural and a lot more damaging. Because after that, it's your entire kind of tax system that that then starts to disintegrate. So in terms of Ireland, in terms of this kind of policy, it is extremely short term, because instead of actually having a system where we have a sustainable and natural kind of tax base, we have one where into the race back to the bottom, this is being continually undermined.
Liza, multinationals might swamp the smaller players, but by targeting the multinationals, won't that also have an adverse effect? Might they not look at Ireland or whatever country comes next and say, you're no longer competitive enough, you've broken the rules, your reputation is no longer intact?
Well, I think we need to make a distinction here between multinationals and single companies, which was mentioned by one of the other participants, because there are different rules. If you are a multinational, you can decide to transfer your profit into various different member states, whereas single companies do not have that option. But to answer your question, whether they would find another, yes, they would. They would. And we are discussing short-term versus long-term here. And I hear that Conor, he's saying that this is short-term. But I would argue it might even be long-term, because if Ireland loses these corporations, they do pay tax. We can debate how much, but they do pay their taxes, and therefore they might lose all of that, and they may lose jobs as well. So they would just move on to a different member state in Europe, or even outside Europe. And that may have an impact on investment and growth and jobs.
Liza, maybe it's time now to tell us briefly, if you will, about how it works within the EU when it comes to making decisions about how a country runs itself. Is the EU in a position to tell Ireland that they have to change their own rules? Is that the way it works?
Yeah, well, let me tell you, the treaty, which is the one that the European Commission is following, have a provision on state aid. And through these state aid rules, the European Commission, they have the ability to go and look into national tax system. What they can do is they can look at Ireland has entered into an advanced pricing agreement with Apple. So they do have the authority to look into those deals. They don't have the authority to then tell Ireland how they should organize their tax. So they can't decide what the corporation tax rate should be in Ireland. But they are allowed to go in and scrutinize this advanced pricing agreement that they have entered into with Apple. So that's where the European Commission have a little bit of leeway.
All right. And we know that the Irish government is standing firm on this at the moment, and ministers in Dublin are due to discuss the tax demand. Ireland's finance minister has already said the verdict will be challenged. But across the Atlantic, the US government and Apple are also hitting back at Brussels. Tom Ackerman has more from Washington, D.C.
The $14 billion tax ruling against Apple is the latest blow to US-based corporations by the EU. Last year, it ordered Starbucks to pay the Netherlands €30 million in back taxes. McDonald's and Amazon are under investigation over their tax deals with Luxembourg. Google, Microsoft, and Intel have also been charged and fined for abusing the EU's competition laws. The White House, echoing the U.S. Treasury Department, says the EU is undermining multinational efforts to deal with tax avoidance.
A more effective approach is coordinating with the United States and working cooperatively to make progress, as opposed to just acting unilaterally in a way that could set a new unfair precedent and ultimately disadvantage U.S. workers and U.S. businesses.
Campaigners who applaud the EU ruling say the Obama administration is doing little to advance international tax fairness.
Their current proposal would be a massive tax giveaway to multinational corporations like Apple, a tax holiday that would further stifle competition.
While the U.S. government has come to Apple's defense in this dispute, it actually stands to lose, in theory at least. Right now, the more U.S. companies pay in taxes to other governments, the more they collect foreign tax credits here. That means lower taxes on whatever profits they might repatriate back to the U.S. The trouble is there's little incentive for them to bring home those earnings under the current 40% corporate tax rate. So the $230 billion that Apple keeps parked abroad is likely to stay there, regardless of the EU ruling, which Apple may appeal for years to come. Tom Ackerman, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Tove, there must be a sense of irony there. You'd think that the US would celebrate this massive trading bloc being targeted, its competition, but in actual fact, the US doesn't like this latest EU ruling. What sort of row are we about to witness between the US and the EU?
Well, they're basically fighting about who gets to tax the multinational corporation, and this is a very old fight. We actually have some international guidelines on how to tax a multinational corporation, but those guidelines are extremely unclear and they're full of loopholes, and that's how we ended up in this mess where governments are falling over each other to try and offer sweet deals to multinational corporations, and at the end it's basically all the citizens that are missing out because the companies move their profits to wherever they got the sweetest deal. And in the case of Apple, it looks like we lost around 13 or 14 billion euros. Imagine what that money could have done in hospitals and in schools and for police officers. And I mean, this is a massive loss for the citizens. And it's not just Europe and the US. Some of the countries that are losing out the most are actually the world's poorest countries, because they are the ones that really don't manage to get a bite of this pie and be part of this absurd tax war that's going on.
Conor, if you look at how much taxes is being lost there, not just only in Ireland, but in other parts of the world, how does it make you feel when Ireland says, no, we don't want this tax back, thank you very much?
I mean, it is very difficult to see where the public interest is in the government saying that it will appeal this decision. It is hard to fathom where the rationale for that is actually kind of coming from. Because these taxes, if they were due during the time when Ireland was forced into a bailout kind of programme. So in like 2010, Ireland would rather take money from the IMF than actually just charge Apple the going rate of like 12.5%. So we have had in that period, like we had 300,000 jobs lost, 250,000 Irish people, young people, who have emigrated. 56% of all kind of secondary roads in Ireland are in a serious state of like disrepair. It would cost an estimated $3 billion just to get Ireland's roads back up to level. Now, an earlier person said that that if the multinationals left, then that would cost jobs. There are around 2 million people who work in Ireland. Around 7.5% of them are employed like by kind of multinationals, which means that around 92% are not employed by kind of multinationals. And that's what actually keeps the Irish economy going. It's those small to medium-sized kind of businesses. And if you've got problems in terms of transport, in terms of infrastructure, that will cost you jobs. And that's why I would say that this is extremely kind of short term. We need massive investment in capital infrastructure in Ireland. The Irish kind of lobby group, IBEC, that lobbies, ironically, for kind of multinationals, has called for a massive public capital investment programme in Ireland over the next kind of 10 years, which is great. I agree with him. But how do you pay for it? It's through taxation.
Liza, some economists will say that these deals done with the US, these inversion deals, helped Ireland get back onto its feet. I mean, obviously there are two different camps here, but if those inversion deals are seen as being that important, how is the conversation going to play out between the US and the EU? Will somebody have to back down?
Well, it's obviously difficult to say what will happen in the future. But it's quite clear that the reason why the US is a bit upset is that there is a very good multilateral conversation going on internationally on the G20 as well as the OECD to trying to deal with tax avoidance and the base erosion profit shifting project. So the US is not only upset about whether they get a bite of the tax or not, they are upset with the fact that the European Union, the European Commission seems to go rogue here and ignoring what has been agreed on the international level.
Tove, Apple's Cook, who was making announcements after this recent decision, said, and I quote him, he said, "This would strike a devastating blow to the sovereignty of EU member states over their own tax matters." Are we seeing sovereignty being targeted here by this decision? And does this sort of decision lead to that sort of Brexit mentality that we've seen happen in the UK recently?
It's actually not this decision by the European Commission that's challenging sovereignty. We must remember that what happened was that Ireland gave Apple a sweet deal, and then Apple moved all its profits that they had gotten from Africa and from the Middle East and India and Europe, and they transferred that to Ireland. And that meant that all of the other countries were losing out on their tax income. Their whole tax system is being undermined. And that is something that challenges not just sovereignty, but actually the economy. And I would also disagree that we have good negotiations going on in the OECD. The OECD is also known as the Rich Countries Club, because it's basically a club where more than 100 developing countries are not allowed to participate in the negotiations. And they have set the global tax rules for the last 50 years. They actually created these rules that clearly don't work. So we need a new tax system, but we also need to stop having this club of rich countries setting the tax rules for everyone else. That's simply not fair. And it also undermines sovereignty in all the countries that are not allowed to participate.
Conor, what is your suggestion for a solution that will hopefully appease all parties?
Well, I mean, like part of this is to see like where the full implications of the decision will kind of play out, because although the headline figure is like 13 billion, that is 13 billion of tax that is owed, were it be paid in Ireland alone. But as has been pointed out, this is tax that's probably owed in like other countries. So that bill, it may be higher, and Ireland then may kind of lose out if it does, kind of go through on that figure. But the issue here is that we cannot have a situation where billions of tax money is being filtered away and is not being kind of recycled back into the economy, that's being put back into areas of infrastructure that will lead to growth in the future, be that in Ireland or in Germany or in Italy or in Africa. That's the real issue here, is that it is extremely kind of short term to think that we can somehow avoid paying tax and still have a functioning kind of society. That is not the case.
Okay, let me just quickly throw this to Liza finally for a final comment. Is there a magic solution here?
Well, the magic solution is that the European Commission will start obeying the rule of law and create legal certainty in Europe, so companies would like to invest in Europe.
Liza Lovdahl-Gormsen, Tove Maria Ryding and Conor McCabe, very good to get your thoughts on this topic. Thank you. And thank you for watching. You can see the programme again if you fancy anytime by visiting our website aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. Mine is @Jane Dutton. And from me and the rest of the team, thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye for now.